Hello and welcome back to the Art House. In this episode I'm going to be running through making handles and attaching them to forms like these laid out on the table to give them a slightly more specific purpose as something like a mug or a jug. I'm going to be working with 1 pound 450 grams of clay. So typically for forms of this kind of size, I, as a rule of thumb, tend to get about 5 handles out of a 1 pound piece of clay. The first thing I'm going to do is just bash it between my palms to make it a bit longer and thinner. This is just going to make it slightly easier to break into 5 roughly even pieces. They don't need to be spot on. There will still be a fair bit of excess clay in each 1/5 of a pound that we'll be working with. So I'm just going to use my thumb and my fingers and just kind of roughly tear it into 5 more or less even pieces. So you don't need to be too precise with it. As long as they're roughly the same size, they'll do just fine. So just clearing a bit of space here. So once we have our 5 pieces of clay, I'm just going to roll each of these out into a sort of conical carrot shape. So to do that, again, I'm just going to even the shape out slightly. So just a very quick pat between my palms, just to iron out any rough edges and corners and that kind of thing. And then each of these I'm going to lay on the surface and just using the palm of my hand here. So I'm angling my hand so that this bottom edge where my little finger is angled towards the table surface, and the area up towards my index finger and thumb is angling up away from the surface. So hand angled like so, and just by rolling each of these pieces of clay smoothly out on the surface with that hand at an angle, we're going to turn each one into this tapered form. So having the clay thicker at one end that we're going to grip and thinner at the bottom end, for reasons that will become clear in a few minutes, that just means things are more likely to be successful whilst we're pulling the handles. So we don't want to roll them out too thin at this stage, it's just the preliminary forming of the handles. So just a few rolls over the surface, like so. So we've now got 5 little carrots to work with. So pulling the handles, we're going to need a tub of water. And it's just going to be a case of, I pull the handle with my right hand, so I'm going to be gripping this thick end up here with my left hand. So we're going to need to make sure there's plenty of water on the clay and on my hand that's touching the clay throughout the whole process. The last thing you want when you're pulling a handle is for there to be any drag between your hand and the clay at all, because that's when, as we're doing this pulling down motion over the surface of the clay, it's going to start snagging, and that's where things start breaking in half and going wrong. So to begin, I'm getting plenty of water on the clay, so just a few passes over just to make sure there's plenty of water on there, plenty of water on my hand as well. So the portion of my hand that I'm going to be using will tend to be this area here between my thumb and my index finger. So the shape that you make here will have an impact on the overall shape that the handle forms whilst you're working with it. There are a few different hand positions to play around with here, which will result in different styles of handles. So by closing off this area, making it narrower, you might end up with thinner strap-like handles. By making it more rounded like so, you might end up with more rounded handles. So to start off with, I'm just going to close off this area between my index fingertip and thumb. And then starting just below where I'm gripping it with my left hand and running down all the way off the bottom. And it really is just a simple case of repeating this motion. You may want to rotate the handle 180 degrees every few pulls. if you want to end up with an even shape on either side. So because this shape you're making between your index finger and thumb isn't a symmetrical shape, if you don't keep rotating the handle 180 degrees like so, you will end up with a handle that's not symmetrical, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's just worth being aware of if you do want them to be symmetrical. So re-wetting my hand every few pulls. And another thing to be aware of is it's important to make sure you're pulling all the way down and off the bottom. What you don't want to do is just kind of work on this middle portion here, because that will result in a kind of thicker, heavier lump of clay down at the bottom here, which can often be a culprit for the handle snapping, which is obviously not something you want to happen. So those are the main things to bear in mind, are just even, consistent pressure, plenty of water. It's more about the repetition rather than squeezing too hard with each go, and making sure it's consistent and coming all the way down off the bottom. So something around about this size and shape will work well for me for this size of mug that I'm going to be attaching them to. So you've got this shape here to consider. It's also worth being aware of the thickness as viewed from the side. You don't want the handles to be wafer thin, because if they are too thin, they'll be very fragile when it comes to letting them dry out before you attach them. Attaching them will be more risky. As they dry out, they might be more likely to crack and split. So as a general rule, something about 1/2 centimetre thick tends to work quite well. You don't want them too chunky, because again, they can then just feel quite chunky and clumsy and not that nice to hold. So this thickness of the cross section here is worth paying attention to. There's more freedom for creative possibilities in this profile here. Some people prefer wider, strappier handles, other people prefer narrower handles. So it really is just a case of experimenting and seeing what works for you. So that will work for me for a first handle. So when it comes to leaving them to dry out, I'm going to use a tile. There are two ways to leave them to dry out. One way involves using this thick pad of excess clay here. So all of this excess is not going to be used to attach the handle to the piece, it's just going to be chopped off when the piece has dried out. So you can kind of smush all of this excess clay down onto the tile and use it as a kind of support, and then just leaving it to dry out naturally like this. Gravity kind of does the work for you and naturally incorporates this curve into the handle. Another way of leaving them to dry out, if I just very quickly whip up another, is to lay them flat on their side. So I'm going to lay this down on the tile like so. If you're doing it this way, you will want to make sure that you incorporate some curve into the handle as you leave it to dry out. What you don't want to do is leave it to dry out kind of straight like so, because then once it's stiffened up and you're getting ready to attach it, you don't want to be kind of bending it around too much, because once it's stiffened up, it'll be more likely to crack. So just incorporating that curve into it as we leave it to dry out, and just very quickly rustling up a few more. So we're going to leave these handles to dry out now. Depending on the atmosphere in the room in which you're working, the amount of time you need to leave these handles to dry out will vary quite a lot. In a hot, dry climate, they could be ready to start attaching to pieces in as little as half an hour to an hour. In a cooler or damper environment, they could stay too soft and floppy like these are now for quite a few hours. You can give them a blast with a hairdryer if you're pressed for time, but you do just need to be careful not to dry them out too much because that can stress the clay, and that's where you can start getting problems with cracking and falling apart. So if you are going to use a hairdryer to speed things up, do err on the side of caution. Check that they're not getting too stiff too quickly, and you can always go back and stiffen them up a bit more. Ideally, leaving them to dry naturally is preferable, but hair drying is an option if you are a bit stuck for time. So you want them to be stiff enough that you can hold them sideways like so, and they still retain some of this curve in them, but there does also want to be a fair bit of flexibility to them, so that whilst you're attaching them, they're not so brittle that they start falling apart. So some curve like so, but still a bit of give in there. In terms of the pieces you're attaching the handles to, they want to be dried out to the leather hard stage. So you want to be able to handle them confidently without feeling like there's any risk of them distorting or flexing or deforming. But they don't want to be too dry. So if they're starting to get so dry that they're starting to change colour and get paler, which happens as clay dries out, that's a good indicator that they're getting too dry, and that can cause issues with adhering the handles successfully. So if the pot is getting too dry when you attach handles, there can be a risk that the handles crack and split away from the body as things dry out. So these are all, there's a very slight amount of flexibility and give to them, but I can pick them up and I can handle them without feeling like I'm worrying about accidentally changing the shape of them. So I'm just going to move my tub of water out of the way momentarily. So now it's time to cut these handles down to size. So as they are, there's plenty of excess here. We're only going to be using a middle portion of this handle, so we're going to be getting rid of all this excess lumpy stuff up here, and we'll be chopping some away down at this far end also. So when it comes to measuring up your handles, you will want your piece that you're attaching your handle to hand. So just doing it as a vague kind of by eye comparison. So I'm going to start by using my needle just to cut through the handle. I'm going to start by leaving excess at either end, and then by sizing it up against the piece, I can then start to cut it down at either end until it's a size that I'm happy with. What you don't want to do is chop off too much handle too quickly and then find that you've got a handle that's too small. So the angle that you cut through the handle at will make a difference to how the handle joins the body. So if I just kind of mark out 3 different examples. So if we treat each of these lines that I've drawn here as the body of the piece, so this middle line here, the body would join the piece at that sort of angle and the handle would come out more or less horizontally from the body. If we cut it at more of an upwards inflection like so, the handle is going to come outwards, curving upwards. Or if we were to cut it at this angle here, the handle would come away from the body at more of a downwards curve. So that's something worth considering, is the angle that you want the handle to come away from the body at. For the purposes of this one, I'm just going to cut down through the middle and cutting off a small amount at the far end too. So sizing these up next to each other, that actually looks like quite a good fit. It may be a smidge on the big side, so I'm just going to pop it back down and just take a tiny amount more away. It's just cutting down through with the needle. So something like that looks good to me. So the next consideration is where on the body you want this handle to join. So the top edge of the handle here, you might want it right up at the rim and have the bottom kind of joining the body somewhere like that. You may want it down at the bottom, so the bottom of the handle is more or less adjacent to the table. You may want it somewhere in the middle. You also want to consider how far apart you want the top and the bottom of the handle to be. So closing them in together like so, you could have this sort of effect going on, or by widening them further apart, you can have a handle that spans more of the body. So once you've got your handle in place and you're happy with the position, the size and the shape of it, I would tend to rest the handle on the top edge like so. So just checking that the handle is in line from top to bottom. It might sound obvious, but you don't want to run the risk of the handle joining at a sort of weird angle like so. That's just making sure that the top of the handle lines up vertically with the bottom of the handle is worth considering. And then just making sure that's stable. I'm going to grab my needle again and just draw a box around the top and the bottom where the handle joins the body. I'm then going to put the handle to one side to rest for a moment. So we now have these areas drawn out on the body, which is where the handle is going to join. And this is where our water comes back into play. So we're now going to cross-hatch these surfaces and incorporate water into the surface of the body to produce a liquid clay, which we call a slip, which is going to act as a sort of cement to help the handle and the body successfully stick together. So the way I'm doing this is just dipping the point of my needle into the water and roughing up that surface. So in one direction to start with, and then cross-hatching. So it is important to be really thorough with this. The last thing you want is, after all the time you've spent making your pieces, making your handles, attaching them together, firing them, all of that, is to find that they're cracking and falling apart from each other. So just being really thorough, spending a bit of time with this cross-hatching, scoring and slipping to really work the surface up into a rough paste. So something like that should be sufficient. Same again down on the bottom end here. So I would now be confident that having scored and slipped it in that way, the handle would now be safe from falling off as it dries. Same again on the handle, so either end wetting and cross-hatching. And now it's time to join them together. So starting at the top end, I'm just firmly pressing the two together, giving it a bit of a wobble, and then same again down at the bottom. And just double checking that it's in line vertically. Then just using the tip of my finger, I'm smoothing off these joints and really blending the two surfaces together to ensure that they're well stuck. Once the piece has dried out further, there will be an opportunity to give things a wipe over with a damp sponge or a wet fingertip to further refine and get rid of any rough edges and creases and that kind of thing. For these areas here that it might be difficult to fit a fingertip in, I like to just use sort of length of the needle to get into that joint and tidy it up. And then once it's attached, you can just gently nudge it, poke it about a bit and get it to a curve that you're happy with. So something like so, looks good to me. When it comes to leaving these to dry out, I tend to leave them upside down. If there's any flexibility left in this handle, by leaving it to dry out upside down, the handle may sag slightly and kind of end up curving that way more. Whereas if you leave it to dry out the right way up, like so, it can tend to sort of slump downwards like this, which may not result in the shape of the handle that you had to start with. So worst case scenario, it can end up getting more kind of dumpy and bottom heavy like so, whereas by leaving it to dry out this way up, you'll tend to end up with it a bit more elegant. Another thing to consider when leaving these to dry out is that it can be worth wrapping them in plastic just to help them dry out a bit more slowly and at the same rate. If they dry out too quickly, because we have these joints which are potential points of weakness, if it dries out too fast, that can also be a culprit for the handle cracking away from the body where it joins here and here. So if you're uncertain, or to play it safe, or if you're working in a particularly hot or dry environment, wrapping it up loosely will just help slow the drying process down and reduce the risk of breakage. So that's one example of how to attach a handle. I'm just going to run through these other 4 now, just so that you can get an insight into the different possibilities available when it comes to attaching handles. So 1 or 2 last little bits and pieces to bear in mind when you're making and attaching handles are, as these dry out and as they're fired, the whole thing is going to shrink by a slight but noticeable amount. Depending on the type of clay you're working with, typically it'll be between 10 to 15%. So when you're making and attaching your handles, it's worth being aware that these will shrink and the opening here that your fingers can fit inside will get smaller. So you do want the handles to be slightly bigger at this stage, because what you don't want to happen is once everything has shrunk and compacted down, to find that you're struggling to fit your fingers into these openings without your fingers kind of touching the hot mug. So the last thing you want is to have a handle that's too small, so your fingers here are getting burnt by the hot mug when you're trying to pick your drink up. So, as with everything clay, practice will make perfect. So, go and have a go at that, make a few dozen handles and see how things come along. But for now, that's all we're going to go into. So we will see you soon, and don't forget to check out our other videos, subscribe, leave a comment if you want, all that kind of thing. See you soon.